Welcome to another episode of the Individuation Podcast. I'm Dr. Lahab Al Samurai. With me today is Dr. Allan Guggenbuhl. We are going to discuss uh, his book, Men, Power, and Myth, The Quest of Male Identity. One of your early books, I think, Dr.
Yes.
Guggenbuhl. It has a foreword by Robert Bly, the poet. And you could get these at Abe Books. I was able to get them at Abe Books, but you could try Amazon again. Um, I'm sure if they get enough requests that they'll start carrying it again. So part of what we're going to try to do today is I'm going to ask Dr. Guggenbuhl some questions about the first chapter. We're going to do the first chapter. And the first chapter is titled The Psychology of Neglect of Men, or Psychology's Neglect of Men. And it says that I think you call it Men as Deficient Beings is how you start out. And what I wanted to say is I wanted to read a little bit from here. And a dream that you had. So on page 13 of the bottom paragraph, you say, I am reminded of one session in my own psychoanalysis in which I discussed a very meaningful dream. In the dream, I was an inmate at Dachau concentration camp. I was somehow able to escape this inhumane situation after an odyssey over numerous passes in the Alps, overcoming various impediments. I was finally captured again. I was to be shot. But first, the Nazi executioners forced me to eat wood. At the end of the dream, I was freed by the Allies and released in a mountain meadow. Then you talk about, how did my therapist react? She nodded, began asking me about my personal associations. And then you go on to talk about, I thought of new photographs from World War II. She asked about the fate of the Jews and the role of my native Switzerland played. My therapist is not satisfied. Apparently, she wants me to be more personal. Straining, I try to connect the dream with my everyday life situation. Why am I resisting? Finally, I make a connection to tensions in one of my relationships. The discussion with my therapist is adamantly revealing and worthwhile, but at the same time, I have a curious stale feeling at the end of the hour. The session did not satisfy me. The dream collapsed and became banal. Something was taken away from me. Was this kind of psychological work really the right way to reflect about my dream? Tell me about this dream. I think it's an interesting dream.
Well, first I have to make some statements, perhaps,
Sure.
to the book, and then I'll talk about that particular dream. I mean, I've written the book because then, when I've written it, but also nowadays, there was kind of a continuous bashing of men. You know, men, kind of deficient beings, men have to learn, and gender became very important, and so. And I personally, I'm a psychologist, so I went through psychoanalysis, I studied psychology. So I was very much confronted with this notion that, as man, you have to learn to formulate personal feelings. As man, you repress your feelings often. So we have to learn. We have to learn to consider our emotions. We have to learn to be more personal. This was kind of a mantra which I was confronted with in my studies, a mantra which I heard during education and also at the fields I worked. That actually, as a man, you have to kind of acknowledge more the personal side of your life, the influence from your family, the influence from relationship. And actually, this is the way I started. And then, after a while, through my personal analysis, but also through other encounters and observation, I thought, is this really the case? Is this, I mean, is this the right path? And then gradually, and coming back to that dream, there was kind of one experience I had. I had this dream, and the dream, as I said, had an impact on me, was important for me. But I was sitting there in a consultation room, having my analyst, who was a good analyst, in front of me, talking about this dream. And so I actually expected it to connect it to something because I felt it had a lot of energy. I felt it perhaps also contained some kind of message. But the whole session then was completely unsatisfactory. It left me void. It kind of, as you said, the dream collapsed. I walked out and said, well, okay, is that that? She kind of connected it to some issue, I forget what. And then I started dwelling on it and I started thinking of it. And then, of course, I realized that the dream did not just contain a personal issue. It wasn't just a reflection of my personal life, but it was a reflection of something which actually we're all and still confronted with. It's our past in Europe, of course, with the dreadful past, the dreadful history, Europe destroying itself and building itself up again, this outrageous Hitler regime of the Third Reich, and the different the different protagonists in this whole series, being the National Socialists, Hitler, the party, and then the Allies, and then Switzerland in the middle. These were grand stories around. And these were stories which were paramount everywhere somehow. These were actually the basis, the foundation of a lot of our beliefs, the foundation, a lot of our fears. And when I started to include the history, when I started to include, what I knew about, Dachau, the concentration park, suddenly the whole dream had a completely different meaning. Suddenly it opened up. Suddenly it gave me some kind of vigor, some kind of understanding. And I thought, well, perhaps this dream is not just personal, but perhaps it's also a reflection of what is around me. Perhaps it's also a reflection of the whole context I'm living in. Perhaps it also contains some kind of elements from not just my personal past, but from the past of Europe, of Germany. And perhaps I have to have a broader mind. And that was something which actually then in this analytical hour I had started to impress me. And of course, as a psychologist, I thought, well, how come was only the personal important? How come did you only ask me about my personal notions? What was the story? Because psychology is about understanding human beings. Psychology is about, uncovering hidden motives. Psychology is about having an idea of one's own plans, future. So how come I'm sitting here doing analysis and all this is kind of not touched? Is it that I'm actually incapable of reflecting personally? Is it that I'm incapable of wording what goes, the connections? Is it that? And
I
of
don't
course,
think so, bro. You could relate personally.
I could
My
relate.
my experience of you has always been you're able to relate personally. What
Yes,
was it about the dream, the way she asked you to
she
associate with the
does.
dream
Yes,
that
but
left you wanting? What was that thing that she did?
she put it back. She related it to personal experience in my life, towards my then girlfriend, towards I forget, some kind of I think them parents, identifying something as a boss. I forget, but that's the way she talked.
Mm.
I forget exact. So she talked. Well, this must be represent a symbol of your work situation. Dachau, symbol of my work situation. When this escaping through the Alps must be kind of signifying that you're trying to cross borders, get somewhere else, and so it was all personalized. Of course, it was my personal dream, but I think my dream was also a medium. My dream was also containing something which was not, in a sense, personal, that it has to be can be understood with metaphors, with in relation to my individual life, but which might be only be understandable with when you relate to the broader context of the psychology of a group, of a nation, or what I would later call it in mythology. That's actually what actually put me on
Mm.
that.
So you said I wanted to um, cover some of this. It's very interesting. You said the insidious power of the consulting room, which I found very inflammatory, but it's fun. Um, you say on page 15, I have posed the question of whether psychology has failed to grasp what is essentially male. To answer this question, we need to examine the manner and style of psychotherapeutic work. Where and how, with whom the men of psychology did their work influenced the conclusions they drew. So you were talking about Jung and Freud as you go on in the page. Um, and you say we have to take into account down the page, we have to take into account the nature of this place where the analytical work occurs. The setting influences, we think, and contributes to how the soul manifests itself. We have to relate to Freud and Jung's insight, as well as those of psychotherapy in general, with this place of meeting. Next to the secrets of the unconscious, intimacy is the subject of the consultation room's exploration. What the founding fathers of depth psychology observed was colored by the place and the ritual that they chose for their work. The personal encounter of two human beings in a closed room served as their medium for the investigation of the soul. Behind a closed door, the patient and therapist sit opposite one another, or the patient lies on the couch while the analyst sits behind him on a chair. The therapist directs his attention to his patient, listens to his problems, and tries to feel his way into the patient's situation. The therapist attempts to understand the patient, to emphasize with him and explore with his understanding and empathy the background of the patient's problem and difficulties. Why does he suffer from self-doubt? What do the anxieties, attacks, or sense of alienation mean? Together, they arrive at the conclusion. Usually, they seek a consensus and develop thereby a story that is true for both of them. Through his personal contact with the patient, the psychotherapist discovers the source of the patient's suffering and guides him to healing. So, and then you go on of what happens in the consulting room. But tell us about what you're thinking when you're talking about the forefathers and how they started psychology and how their psychological method started to influence the way they viewed the feminine or masculine aspect of psychology?
Well, let me start like that. Freud, Jung, and others actually, 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, actually, they're in a way of discovering something very important. And they were actually in a way of trying to decipher soul. I call it soul. I think the expression soul is not so, it's a good expression, meaning some kind of energy which actually manifests itself through images, pictures, which energizes ourselves. So they're actually soul searchers. They search soul, and that was actually the basic notion. They were trying to find out what is soul. Now, soul expresses itself in different settings, in different surroundings. And I think that's very important to know. And in order to find
Can you
out,
explain that a little bit, Alan? Can you talk about how soul expresses itself in different
I'm
surroundings?
just about to explain it. What I mean is the way actually we encounter this energy is we encounter it in different places. We can encounter the soul when we're perhaps in the mountains in Switzerland and suddenly touched and with ideas, fantasy, emotions. We can encounter it when we, on different ways. But I'll explain that part. But when we soul is often contained also in cars, for instance. Especially men, they make the development through cars. I remember once visiting someone in the United States, and it was not in the East Coast, not in the West Coast. It was near St. Louis, and he invited me, and it came to, and it was a man, and it was a couple I actually met, and we were was received, and he said, "Oh, hi, yeah, great to meet you," and so, and he didn't talk that much. She talked about what you're doing, what they made, and he was actually more or less mute. So "Oh, yeah, so we want to be here, and so you have a good trip." So the usual. That's what he said. And then afterwards, we stood in the garden, and they had a big, huge garden, and I discovered a Chevy in the garden, an old Chevy, which with no number plates, and so I said, what's a Chevy?" He said, "Oh well, that's actually the second car I bought." So he walked to the car, and then he started relating how he bought the car, what he invested in, what he experienced with it. And then he said, it was he made out with someone in the car. And then he had another car. Huge. And so he had another car, which was then a station wagon somehow.
So the car was in the middle of the garden.
Yeah, but it was a huge garden. I mean,
Yeah.
it's
He was using it like a
yeah,
like part of the garden.
yes, it was. No, it was hidden behind.
Oh,
It wasn't actually exposed. It was a bit more hidden, but he had kept it. You could see he kept his cars. But it was fascinating to see
like
that
a little kid who hides his toys.
yes, exactly. It was not even to hide it. It didn't distinctly expose it. It just had them in the garden. And then I realized he started talking about it. He started talking about the 60s. He started talking about the 80s. He started talking about the challenge and job. He started to talk about, and I realized his soul was in cars. Cars were a container of his whole development. So it's actually through cars he could connect to himself. So now back to your questions. Now, the question is, where does soul express itself? That for our fathers of psychoanalysis, Freud, Jung, they were trying to decipher soul, but they, of course, worked in the consultation room. Worked vis-a-vis someone, encountering, sitting there. So it was a very intimate place. It was a place where actually looking each other in the eye, seeing each other, being related to someone was of prime importance. Was actually the way you approach someone. And also, then the whole, and I think this influenced it. So the ritual, which was chosen by Jung, Freud, is a ritual which is very much focused on the personal history, on where soul expresses itself in the personal history. It wasn't a setting, Freud didn't go and look at, well, there were cars. With Jung, there were a lot of cars. They didn't go and look at different cars. One, just on the sidelines, which is also interesting, which one doesn't know about Jung? Jung was very fascinated by sports cars. And he loved driving a sports car, especially after it rained, because he loved driving through puddles and kind of soaking people who were pedestrians. He also had this fascination. So, but it's completely.
I didn't know that. That's interesting. They don't talk much about that.
About sports cars. He chose completely another path. And I think for those times, it was okay. It was fine. It was understandable. But what actually then happened, the whole psychology started to be defined by a certain setting, personal encounter, metaphors, narratives from the past, parents, and suddenly also parents became important,
Mm,
childhood became important. I'm not saying that that's not important.
mm,
It is important. It's
mm,
of course, and it's also decisive, and also has tremendous influence. But there's another aspect.
mm.
The other aspect is what I call myth. Probably now we would call it a bit different, but other actually the way soul expresses itself in other settings. Cars is one example, but it's also history. It's
Sports, um,
sport. It's
going out with a group of men to have a drink.
maybe that's a root.
Conversation
Yeah,
changes itself. So the activities that males um, feel free in to express soul, if I may,
yeah,
um, is not the same as sitting in the consultation room, which is
absolutely.
much more intimate and much more feminine in respects, because um, it was not it wasn't a masculine venue for the treatment of the male client.
Yes, it was some kind of, it's a setting which also, what I'm saying is the setting defined the content of what was talked. The setting defined the, the images which emerged. This is psychological. That was defined by the second setting. I mean, nowadays we know that. As you know, there's a lot of research
Yeah,
showing that the way people talk is from the concept. So that's actually what happened to.
yeah. I mean, the way we work with kids, we work with them outdoors now. We work in different settings because this is what they need to express soul,
I think now
to
we
express self.
not there, but actually, then actually this was the notion, the focus, and also, of course, it was mainly women they worked with,
Mm,
and especially Jung. He was actually concentrated on women,
mm,
and his whole psychology. I think he got very much influenced by. He was actually studying, exploring a psychology which, in its tendency, only in its tendency. I mean, I don't believe in fixed gender
mm.
stereotypes. In its tendency, um, was more attractive to women,
Yeah.
and
Well, that
that
would make sense because he would have been informed of the psychology, informed of the way the psychology was unfolding based on the clients that you are treating. So when I was studying in Chicago and I was working in a place and I was working with disturbed kids, I was informed of soul through the disturbed kid. So I was formed by their disturbance, by their environment, by um, the way they perceive the world. And that's how my psychology, my understanding of young psychology was relayed to me, because it affects a lot of what we do depending on who we start working with.
absolutely, and it's very interesting, because I think both Jung and Freud, they had a kind of what's the word, hinge, got intuition that actually there's something else, because Freud started, developed his Oedipus complex,
Yeah,
the myth of, he started quoting myths
yeah.
to understand the individual psychology,
Mm,
which is a very interesting step.
yeah.
So he himself thought mythologically, probably in myths, but he used it then actually to understand individual. And I think Jung also, he started to go into alchemy, going into yeah, archetypes, mythology, but he actually had both sides. But I think he didn't do the step by thinking, wait, we have to maybe refocus a little bit. Human beings are not just primarily determined or by their individual stories or psychology, but the whole mythological surrounding.
Mm.
It's also a
So,
tremendous.
so his book, Totem and Taboo, Freud's book, Totem and Taboo, is his dream of creation.
Yeah.
And in the dream of creation in the book, and I'll summarize, and I hope I'm not too far off. Basically, what there is an old father who all the women in the tribe belong to him, and any son who reaches a adolescent age or um, starts to become a man is shunned from the family, is shunned outside, is basically chucked outside, and is no longer able to stay within the family, and cannot be with any of the women. So this happens to all the male children in this tribe, in Totem and Taboo. And they get together and decide to kill the father. And in their moment of rage, they get together and they're so frightened, so terrified of this Godhead that they basically cut the head off. And then they start to have a ritual where they worship the head or ask for forgiveness for severing the head to take back the women and be re-invited into the tribe. So the premise of the psychology is that the male has to decapitate or kill the father to stand in their own.
Now, I would say two things. First of all, that was
Oh, we're talking about Totem and Taboo. So there's
yeah. Freud, when Freud based his Totem and Taboo book on ethnological studies in his days, which are nowadays what's the word? I forgot the right word, which nobody would hold, which actually were outdated. But what is interesting is, and that was a trap. I think Freud realized there's collective dynamics. There's dynamics which kind of are not just about the individual family, but broader, which one has to quote in order to understand the development of boys or of men. I think that's the genius side of Freud. He understood that, but it was still kind of tagged in a psychological way, because this might be a misunderstanding. Then, how do you understand a myth like that? It's a myth, a story like that.
Well, it's the
And
myth
of
of
course,
creation.
it reflects the father. It's actually it's about the relation to the physical father, the personal father, the influence of the father, and you have an antagonistic relationship. And so you really, in order to grow up, you have to conquer the father, but at the same time you're ambivalent, so you cherish him afterwards. So that would be a very psychological way of interpreting. And I think that's what probably, I don't know, Freud tended to, but now we can look at it completely different. You could say, well, this is a story about authority, power, about dynamics, a story not about an individual, but something which is in society, which reveals itself in society again and again, in groups, which have no personal connection, which have no relation. So it's in a group. So the father could be an institution. You work at an institution. And in order to achieve something you want in an institution, you have to kind of redefine the whole power issue. There's a power struggle. You have to kill the ideas or the basics of the institution, but at the same time, of course, you have to connect it through cherishing it. So it's not actually about just, the personal development, but it's also about how, especially men, behave, bring themselves into a collective institution, a collective body or entity. That's actually, it was interesting. This is kind of a dynamic which reveals itself again and again in young boys. They search for a father, but not the father as a representative of the family, but a father outside, and start to use the codes. And I give you an example, which I just had to 3 days ago, which was interesting. Parents and the father of a 15-year-old was behaving outrageously in Zurich, kind of, and he came to me, and he was a social worker. He was very considerate, very reflective, and he said, and his mother was there, and he said, "I don't understand this. I just don't understand this. My son was beaten, attacked someone in the schoolyard, beat him up because the other one had said, 'Your mother.'" And now your mother, we call it Didi Mutter. Now this is a code among certain ethnic groups in Switzerland in order to legitimize yourself to have a fight.
Yeah.
It's a provocation, quick provocation. Then you have a fight. It means you've insulted my mother. Now, what is fascinating, this is something which is this provocation is not linked to the actual mother. So it's a word or a provocation, a verbatim, which serves as a provocation, which is actually has its meaning from a completely different setting, from the setting of a collective dynamics, where this is kind of someone that's the super chief, and then the opponents, and then that's where it's used. This father said, "This is bizarre. My son would never fight for the honor of his mother. This is, he doesn't care." But he kind of entered the scene, he was joining some kind of collective myth with others. And this was the specific code. Now, if you had this in analysis in therapy, this boy, and he said, "Why do you fight for your mother? I mean, do you want to protect your mother?" You're completely off the track. It's not about that. It's about joining a group with codes which actually is founded on the specific myth of kind of, conquering each other, gaining power. So it's a completely different story.
There's a story my father tells about us when we first arrived in the United States in 1975, when he was studying at university. He was studying ESL, so he was learning the language. So we would go to school. We didn't speak the language, so we would go to school and come back. And there was this kid who basically was a crossing guard who used to pick on us. And we'd come home and we'd cry to my father. We'd complain about this kid bothering us or picking on us. So one day my father looked at us. It was like, we were pretty young. We didn't speak the language. We were in a foreign country. And he said, "You cannot come home. You are not my children if you do not stand up for yourself and beat this kid. If you do not fight back, then don't bother coming home." So me and my brother are walking to school discussing how we have no home if we don't stand up to this kid. So there was very little. We were around the ages of 8, 9. I was, and my younger brother was 6. And so we're discussing how we're not going to have a home. So we're on our way back, and this kid is much bigger than us. So what my brother does is he goes on all fours behind the kid, and I push the kid. He falls in the snow, and we jump on top of him, and we're just like hitting him on the snow. And my mother is very far away. She's holding our little brother. She comes running, screaming, "Sorry, sorry, sorry, sorry," and she's trying to get us off of him. So we go home, and my mom is very upset with us. She's like, what are you guys doing? What are you thinking? And my father looked at us, and he was very, very proud. And he said, "Now you are my sons." So he tells the story. He tells the story all the time in different settings. He tells the story. we just took it as, you know, father telling stories. We didn't, but it was a big thing for him that his sons stood up, that they stood up for themselves. So he still tells that story today. Um, it's an interesting story because it didn't, for us it was like, oh, we don't have a home to go to. For him it was much different. It was like it was a rite of passage.
Yeah, that's a very interesting story, and I think there's like two ways of looking at it.
Mm,
One way of looking at it is now from personal psychology. You could say, well, it expresses the relation between your father
mm,
and your father was an immigrant, and he was kind of powerless. So he was actually trying to compensate his not being perhaps accepted yet in the culture by kind of
mm.
invigorating his sons to stand for him. So you could put it on these
Yeah.
lines. Or you could say, well, he was actually quoting some kind of important clan myth, a
Yes.
clan which a foundation of a specific group he belonged to, say, well, if you have to make a stance, you have to kind of impose yourself. It wasn't actually related even to youth and
No.
to the
Yeah.
religion. And the indication is that he kept on telling it.
Yes.
That's an indication that it's actually a myth
Yes, it is.
was
Yes.
relating and not just a personal attitude or approach. He was
No.
quoting a myth, probably from Iraq, so some kind of I don't know myth which was around, which was important. That might have been, but it's not.
Well, yes, because he kept quoting it all these years, and it has a personal aspect, like you said, but it was more of a myth. It was a myth with his sons involved in it at a young age, and he always chuckles when he tells the story, like he's like there's personal delight in the way it unfolded, exactly the way it should have unfolded. And I think in the myth in his head, um, it unfolded the way so it kind of resonated throughout time that he kept telling the story. Now, the story wasn't, I mean, we didn't, we were little kids and it was like a scruff, it was um, like kids rolling in the snow. It wasn't like people bleeding or it's like,
Wasn't that serious?
it
It was
wasn't that serious, but it took this context of, and we were just concerned. I remember telling my brother, "Where the hell are we going to go?" We were just thinking we needed a place like we could go home. For us, we were little kids. It was like, well, you can't go home. Well, how is it you cannot go home? This is so. Um, yeah, these kind of myths, these kind of stories that we tell, um, changes the way we start to uh, it has already changed the way we are interact in the world. We are already different in the world. I think when you talk about males and females, I think I want to go back to your book on page 17. uh, you say something very precise about this. You say, what I'd like to mention a further point regarding psychology's failure to do justice to men's soul. We need to consider who it was who first entered the psychotherapeutic consulting room and for whom this setting was immediately conducive. Both Freud and Jung gained their most important knowledge in dealing with female patients. They discovered the meaning of psychology through working with women. Freud developed his theories of hysteria and neuroses from his experience with Anna O, Emma von N, Miss Lucy, Katharina, Elizabeth von R, and transferred his understanding to men by diagnosing hysteria in men as well as women. Women showed Freud the way to the meaning of the unconscious and the personal trauma. Of Jung, we know that his thinking was stimulated all during his life by his work with women patients, and that Tony Wolff, Yolande Jacobi, Mary Louise von Franz, and Eliaf were important collaborators. In other words, the discoveries of these great psychologists might be only the expression of their confrontation with the feminine soul. Through working with women, Freud and Jung discovered psychology, a perspective that women had long taken for granted. What they declared to be objective discoveries about human nature might in reality be but the results of their attempts to understand the female soul. As investigators, they directed their attention to what was alien and unfamiliar. In doing so, they would of necessity have turned to the psychic orientation opposite their own. They selected a ritual that seemed unusual to them and followed their fascination for the female, something they experienced as a powerful counterposition to their masculinity. They thus expanded the unconscious by adding mysterious dimensions, what they considered to apply in general to the soul of human beings turns out under more critical observation to be the language of the feminine soul. Now you go on to say this is to explain that um, you're naturally, I do not mean by this that they conceived a psychology that does justice to feminine psyche either. Although Freud and Jung moved in a feminine environment, they directed their attention as men to the psyche of women. Their masculine perspective colored what and how they saw. We can assume that they used their masculine system of references to orient themselves in an arena unknown to them. While they looked into the souls of women, they do so with the eyes of men. Their masculine background inevitably intruded in producing what they took as valid answers.
Yeah.
So I think you clarify the point that basically what they started, where their journey started, they were surrounded by those who were willing to go into this therapy in a certain way, and it informed the therapy itself. It's like we say, the observed and the observer are changed by the event. The event doesn't just change the observed, it changes the observer. I think this is what you're trying to say, that the working with female clients changed the way they started to see and understand psychology.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what I want to say is actually what you're pointing out, but I think that I have two other things to say to this. On one hand, I think, Freud, Jung, with their masculine way of thinking, and of course, this is a term you would not use, which is really today outrageous, masculine way of thinking. But I think naturally it's a tendency of using collective myths. And so they actually entered the realm of a kind of a psychology, which in some ways was more lean more to feminine way of thinking. Again, these gender stereotypes are of course very tricky because they can lead us to make categories. But what is very interesting is by actually dedicating themselves, trying to understand women, they actually did a great thing, both men and women. I think this was a good example of shows of manifesting what collaboration between masculine and feminine way of thinking can do. That's the way psychoanalysis or was discovered, or the way of psychological thinking, because men tried to enter a realm which they didn't understand. What actually then happened, of course, that it was very heavily uh, taken concretely. The difference was not seen. It wasn't seen that I think Freud and Jung weren't quite aware of their um, focused man. They were discoverers, trying to enter a realm which is completely different and new. And so that's what they're trying to do. But they were actually doing, they were discovering a lot of dynamics, emphasis, symbols, stories, which actually, in a tendency, are more prone for women.
So I think if I may, I think what you're saying is that they missed the nuance of the feminine in the consulting room because they were working with the feminine. They
Yeah.
missed that nuance. And so when it was transposed into working with men, it also came, the nuance also came to working with men as
Yeah.
working with women in that type of, is that what you're,
That's what I'm saying. And I mean, and the results are clear. I mean, you can see it in our country as in every country. I mean, who goes to see a psychotherapist and psychologist? It's predominantly women.
mm,
So
um,
that's where they feel understood. Someone listens. Someone doesn't just provoke, you know. You know, this is
so
something
so
like
it's the acceptance of the methodology um, that grasps certain male clients as too intimate or
look, there's many different aspects.
okay.
Is one aspect is, for instance, trying to understand someone.
Mhm.
Empathy. I mean, these are very valuable tools or whatever to approach you. Trying to understand, you listen, but it's something which is not the only way to understand soul. With men, often provocation, interrupting, loudness,
Mm,
shouting.
mm.
These are also important elements. You know,
Aggression, physical
no,
positioning or posing.
I would talk it on a reflective mode, not
Well, even in reflective mode, aggression can come out in words. It could come
aggression can
out
come out.
in the
All
way I stand and look at you.
yes, but what
Aggression.
I'm doing now is I'm kind of comparing empathy with provocation. So these are two means of communication. You know, two means to approach someone who's there. And when you empathy is important, but it's actually, if you look at the way, and these are, you know, if you look at modern studies on the way women tend to talk and men tend to talk, and if you see how, this is something you can see on youngsters, this is something you can see with businessmen. When men meet each other, they might ask, "Oh, how are you?" I say, "Well, that's difficult." Okay,
Mhm.
do you, you know,
Yeah,
the
of course.
time they spend on actually investigating how is someone feeling, doing, is very short. Often they don't say anything. Okay, you old buddy, how is there still? And what they do, and there you see a great difference, and it's obvious. You know, as you can see that when women usually tend a lot more to use empathy. They say, "Well, how are? Oh, I'm so sorry. I can imagine that's terrible for you. Yes. How do you feel now? Do you want a coffee? Oh, that's really bad." So that's, and this is a stereotype naturally, but you can see it also from linguistic study. When a man comes and, "How are you?" "Well, I don't know." "Well, you know, life is hard." "Well, you know, you know how women are." You know, they have a completely way of connotation. And there, I think, one doesn't realize that using provocation, using an antagonistic way of talking, interaction, using also loudness is perhaps a more masculine way of approaching. But what has happened now in psychology, that the terms or the methodology or the approach is very much defined by this way of reaching soul, which is predominantly um, uh, dominant or among women.
Um, I really like you go into this quite deeply, actually. On page 18 through 19, you talk about, well, Freud recognized the essential differences between men and women, even though he was of the opinion that, quote, this is Freud, pure masculinity and femininity remain constructions with uncertain contents. And then you go on to talk about how, according to Freud, a boy's superego has a different quality and development history than that of a girl. In a boy, the superego forms toward off the danger of merger with the feminine. By identifying with the contents of the superego, the boy saves himself from a complicated triangulation. He thereby directs his energy to the great necessity of life, through them to the outer world. There is another way we can understand the conflict that Freud attempted to grasp theoretically. This is on page 19, second paragraph. Instead of his psychodynamic interpretation, we could choose a mythological approach. While from a psychological perspective, the superego results from the fear of the father's revenge and of insurmountable instinctual drives, the reverse is the case from a mythical view. The superego does not result from a developmental conflict. Rather, the soul of the individual man arranges situations to guide it to the myth. According to this way of seeing the great necessity of life, the myths are the goal of the process, not simply the result of the boy's development.
Yeah.
And then you, I'm going to go down to the bottom paragraph. You say, a boy is castrated when he allows himself to be, quote Freud, psychologized. By orienting himself only through relational psychology, he loses his specifically masculine aptitude for the mythical. He assumes the psychological perspective when he understands himself only as an individual being and allows himself to be defined from his relationship to his mother. He thus remains cut off from the outer reaches of his soul. The boy must therefore stave off the feminine symbolized for him by the mother, who further represents a particular psychological orientation. Castration anxiety is justified from a male point of view. Men would become feminized were they to follow the fantasy of the merger with the mother and psychology. They would no longer find their way to the myths, where they to place their own personal needs to the foreground and orient themselves exclusively to the mother. According to current understanding in developmental psychology, the Oedipal phase does not apply to all children. Not all girls are in love with their fathers, and not all boys see fathers as a rival. Freud, however, considered his discoveries to be objectively valid. To establish and verify his theory, he cited the Greek myths or supported his position with the ethnological theories of his time. Freud's thinking was masculine. His theory and support for the theory derived from his own mythological orientation to life. I thought that was quite eloquent. You are talking about men of their day and their time. At the same time, you are talking about them as men who saw the world from a masculine perspective. Do you have a thought?
Well, I think that I wrote it down then. I think it's important to see. I mean, it's about soul, it's about connecting, about motivation, what motivates us. And this, this way, in order to understand men, how they function, in order to give them a role in life, actually, we have to consider that there is a difference, and they're actually motivated by different symbols and so on. That's actually what I wanted to say. I think, for me, when I wrote the book, I thought this should be like the second step. There's a first step where one discovered the psychology, which is more feminine, and then the second step would be one would actually then kind of describe or what actually the approach to men could be, because we don't have to. We usually forget that psychology, in some ways, fails to reach men. I mean, this is something we have to really admit as psychologists. I mean, 80%, I think, of the clients are women, and men are usually sent because they fail. They have to go because they have a breakdown, a burnout, and so
Or
women.
somebody tells them to go. They don't
Some
do a pre.
Rarely a man goes by his own will and said, "Well, I'm so interested to know." So rarely, it sometimes happens, of course, and a lot of differentiated men do that, but usually it's kind of a breakdown with them, then they go. But otherwise, men,
Because it's seen as a deficiency in the ability to be masculine. It's seen
absolutely,
as a deficiency to stand up for oneself. If you
exactly.
are masculine and you are going for help, that means you are deficient in that capacity. It's where you say on page 21, I am convinced that a man's soul expresses itself in mythical images. And so that is the conflict. The conflict is it goes against the myth.
But the conflict is it's a wrong language. And then it's, if you see all this, if a man is successful, is a real man, powerful, then he does not reflect on psychology usually. He might do it very much in private a little bit, but it's not something he really admits and does because it's considered, as you said, it's considered then you're being a failure. And for me, it was astonishing after I've written that book that I was by whom I was invited. I was invited by a lot of very male groups, for instance, a lot by the Catholic Church
Mm,
ministers. And invited me there. I was invited by the Freemasons. I was invited by groups of men.
mm,
And they had then heated discussions about themselves,
mm,
about their background. I also got a lot of men who came then to me and wanted to talk about the myths they followed, the big stories in their jobs, in raising their families. And then I realized that's where men start to open.
mm.
That's when they suddenly get interested. But they don't get interested and say, well, of course, maybe you in your job, you kind of react to not have being appreciated enough by your mother. And so that's might also be the case, but they don't move.
Yeah, you say it here at the end of the paragraph. You say men sense that through psychotherapy, they subordinate themselves to a system and a ritual that does not correspond to the primary language of their souls.
Yeah. That's actually what's happening. And I mean, I've written that I think 20 or 30 years ago, quite a long time. And in the meantime, I've done a lot of work when I developed mythodrama because of that, because I realized we need to develop a psychology which also includes man, which is not just based and focused on personal stories, but also uses the expressions, the metaphors, and the big myths which are around, because it's so often also a problem. A lot of men fail because of that. There's a lot of outrageous things happening. I mean, if you look at coming back to the dream, if you look at the Second World War, these were all myths. The
Yes.
Third Reich was a completely perversive myth about purity and crazy ideas. And purity is a myth. If you think of an ethnic group which thinks we have to be pure, we have to, then it was white, blonde. It's bizarre. It's a myth. But if you look at it as a myth, it has a completely different. Then actually you can kind of take its viciousness maybe out of it. And if I worked a lot with youngsters with gangs, and I realized they were also following these big stories. That's why they were violent. That's why they would go out and kind of beat up each other. They were fighting. They were mythological beings. They were actually impersonating some myth they had in their head. I don't hear you anymore.
Sorry about that. I was I'm looking forward to that. That's in chapter 3.
Okay.
I look forward to that conversation because um, that talks about young males, gangs, and identification. I think it's is essential reading for any person who is delving into psychology, who works with male clients or young male clients. Um, Here, I wanted to, on page 23, you said, in the middle of the page, you say, the equality myth governs analytical psychology as much as other psychologies. Analytical psychology joined the legitimate collective trend in calling for equal rights for women in society. Psychology presents itself as a science of emancipation of women. The time has come, however, for us to free ourselves of the myth of equality, to reflect seriously on differences. If we regard the characteristics of gender only as metaphors for various aspects of existence, then emancipation too will stagnate. If we continue to blur gender differences, those anthropological realities shaping our being, we will miss the chance to develop social structures that would make emancipation possible in spite of clear gender identities. Without a sense of difference, we could succumb to the seductive idea of psychic equality and the neglect needed to conceive a language for the male soul. In other words, we all become the same creature, and we're no longer we're no longer within ourselves. We're no longer unique.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. We're no longer unique, and we fail actually to appreciate and integrate a difference, which we also have in soul, and we repress or elude different aspects of life. And when I mean of equality, in German you have Gleichheit und Gleichberechtigung. You have two words, and they use always use two words. Equal rights and
Mm,
equality. So I think it's absolutely understood that equal rights, equal chances, and everything, that's something which is goes for men and women.
mm,
Equality means sameness. You could call it sameness, and this idea that we're absolutely the same.
mm.
That I think is
I,
problematic.
I like that term, sameness instead of equality, because
Yeah,
equality has a political
exactly.
feeling to it.
But it,
Sameness is different. Sameness is a washing out of any kind of distinct identity for the individual client, as if they come from, if they're male or female, or but also where they come from culturally, where they are raised, what type of caregivers they had, who raised them,
yes,
how did they experience the world, how did their society and group experience the world? Um, you talk about Switzerland and the Alps, and um, geography has a lot to do with our experiences of the world.
absolutely.
If we live near the water, if we live near an ocean, if we live in the mountains, if we live in the jungles, if we live in a city, if we live, so all these things affect us in different ways. I think this is part of the point.
Absolutely.
This is so this is our introduction to the first chapter um, of Dr. Guggenbuhl's book. Um, so we're just beginning to kind of um, get dangerous. We,
Okay.
we,
Yeah.
we, we haven't gotten dangerous yet. We've been sidestepping danger. In the second chapter next week, uh, we are going to talk about vessels for nations, myths, culture, profession, and family. The tension between mythology and psychology in Dr. Allan Guggenbuhl's book. Like I said earlier, if you are interested in following along as I go through the book and try to highlight some of the arguments that are being made. Um, of course, as Dr. Guggenbuhl said, this is a book that's 24 years old, so there is some things that need to be looked at, or if he was doing it again, I'm sure he would re-edit certain parts. But if you are interested in following along, Abe Books has it. If you ask Amazon enough times, they should get it back in their stock. And with that, I would like to thank Dr. Allan Guggenbuhl for coming on this journey with me to look over his book, Men, Power, and Myth, The Quest for Male Identity. It sounds more masculine than it is. I know this man for a very long time. And with that, I would like to thank you. I am Dr. Lahab Al Samurai. And today we are going to today we discussed our first chapter, and next week we will go to our second chapter. Dr. Guggenbuhl, thank you for your time. Do you have any words to our listeners? Anything you want to say for today?
No, I thought it's great if you're listening it, and of course, I would be interested also in hearing if someone else has some thoughts or if they can align it to some of their own experiences, of course. But
I am pretty sure we will have feedback. I look forward to it. Thank you again for today.